Hey there, folks. Welcome to a brief video for Aurora West College Prep, Mr. Wilkins and Ms. Ptolemy's U.S. history classes about Native Americans and the War for the American West. Now, Native Americans have a very rich history, a long history in what would become the United States. And today we're just going to be focusing on the time period from 1860 to 1896, a very dark chapter in the history of the United States and in Native American history because of some of the things that were done to the people and the drastic changes that happened in their lives. So let's get started. First of all, the part of the United States we're going to be looking at is the Great Plains. And the Great Plains is the part of the United States that describes the portion of North America between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. So what is west of the Mississippi River and what's east of the Rocky Mountains, so places like Denver and Aurora, Colorado, we would fall into the Great Plains. And so the tribes that lived here would be considered tribes of the Great Plains. And this was occupied by dozens of tribes, and actually dozens doesn't do it justice. There were dozens of major tribes and then kind of branches of these major tribes. And it was a mix of farming tribes like the Osage in Iowa, tribes who set up farms and towns and didn't really move around. But then you had nomadic tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne, tribes that did move around quite a bit. So they would set up towns, but they would then pack up, and move following their food, predominantly the buffalo. And the introduction of horses back in the 1500s forever changed the lifestyles of these tribes. They were first introduced by the Spanish in 1598. Remember, the Spanish arrived in the Americas before any other group from Europe. And with the horses made tribes much more mobile. They were more effective in hunting and more effective as warriors when they fought other tribes or fought against European colonizers. And the main thing they hunted was buffalo. And so, of course, horses made it easier for them to hunt buffalo. And buffalo were central to the lives of Native Americans in the Great Plains. They provided food. They provided shelter. You can make teepees out of the buffalo hides. They provided clothing. You could make robes out of the buffalo wool. And they provided tools, the bones, the horns. The Native Americans can make tools out of those. So here's a map that shows where the Great Plains were, the place in red. So notice how eastern Colorado, so where Aurora is, where Denver is, are part of the Great Plains. And here's a painting that shows how Native Americans might have appeared when they were hunting buffalo on horseback. Later on, they would also use rifles, which were more impactful than bows and arrows. But Native Americans were incredible horse riders and hunters. So this time period is going to see a lot of migration where Americans are going to be moving west into the Great Plains. And they're moving here for farmland and also for mining. Remember, gold and silver and other valuable natural resources were found in places here in the Great Plains. And they argued that the natives who lived here did not improve the land, and so they did not own it. The natives argued back that you can't really own land, that land is there to be shared for hunting and for farming and things like that. Nevertheless, more white Americans moved west thanks to things like the railroads, and white Americans move out here in the thousands. And the United States government signs treaties with Native Americans in attempts to make things peaceful and to allow for sharing of land. But the United States government repeatedly violated these treaties and other agreements made with various tribes. And ultimately, they're going to force tribes onto what are called reservations, which is land that is just supposed to be for the tribes, where the tribes are supposed to stay on that land, which is extremely frustrating. And then there are other moments where the U.S. government is going to violate treaties and agreements. For instance, right here in Colorado, there's a massacre at a place called Sand Creek in 1864, where U.S. soldiers would kill over 150 Arapaho and Cheyenne on a reservation in Colorado. This was after telling them that they could stay there and would not be attacked. And then in 1868, there was a treaty signed at a place called Fort Laramie. And this forced the Sioux tribe, a huge tribe, onto a reservation, but it really was not signed by many tribal leaders. A lot of the members of the Sioux did not recognize this treaty, and the U.S. government only signed it with a few of them. And the most notable Sioux chief to refuse to sign this treaty was Sitting Bull. And Sitting Bull was one of the most important Native American leaders during this time, and he helped lead resistance against the United States government. And here's a map that shows the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota and into North Dakota, which, by the way, still exists today. We'll take a look at the Sioux who live in this area and the impact that they're still feeling. And here's a picture of Sitting Bull, one of the most well-known and most accomplished chiefs of the Sioux during this time. So these disagreements, to use a very very peaceful word, these disagreements between the U.S. government and Native Americans, this is going to lead to war. With the discovery of gold and silver in the Black Hills in the Dakotas, in what was Sioux territory, and the continued migration of white settlers, you're going to have regular fights and conflicts between Native Americans and the whites. The Kiowa, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, Comanche, and Sioux, they protest the U.S. government about these treaty violations, but the U.S. government doesn't do anything about it. And this leads to battles between the tribes and the U.S. cavalry, those units that would ride horses. So this led to wars like the Red River War from 1874 to 75, where it was the Kiowa and Comanche tribes versus the United States. And then there was also the Battle of Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand, in June of 1876, where a band of Sioux, led by Sitting Bull and another well-known Sioux warrior, Crazy Horse, wiped out the U.S. 7th Cavalry, led by Colonel George Armstrong Custer, who was a well-known soldier from the Civil War. And so their defeat was amazing and unpredictable. America was shocked by this defeat. And so while for the Sioux, this was a triumphant victory, the victory was short-lived because the U.S. military went after the Sioux with everything they had. And so the Sioux were quickly crushed after this battle. Sitting Bull even fled to Canada, but finally returned to the United States and surrendered to the U.S. military in 1881. And here's a painting that shows, it's an imaginary painting of Custer's Last Stand. You know, as Custer is standing in the middle with two pistols while the Sioux are riding around with bows and arrows. Most of the Sioux at this time actually had guns, but they still did use bows and arrows very effectively. Now here was a painting that was done by Native American, a Sioux, who was actually at the battle. And so you notice all the soldiers on the ground, as well as some Native Americans. And yeah, this is an actual painting by a Native American who participated in the battle. And this is the actual Native American, I forget his name, who painted it and who was at the battle. So with the defeat of the Sioux, a lot of Native Americans are being forced onto reservations, and they're being forced to assimilate, which means to become more like white Americans. Now, many Americans did protest the treatment of Native Americans. You had a book called A Century of Dishonor, published in 1881 by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson, who exposed the violations of treaties and mistreatment by the U.S. government. However, despite these people who spoke up in support of Native Americans, most Americans supported assimilation, where the Native Americans would give up their own way of life and adapt lifestyles of white America, become more like farmers and learn skills to work in factories, cut their hair, wear clothes that were more like Americans, go to church and become Christians, go to schools that are taught that teach American history. And this was reinforced by things like the Dawes Act in 1887. And this actually divided reservations between individual Native Americans and their families. And this was a big deal because Native Americans really just shared the land. You didn't partition it or break it up between individuals or families in the tribes. Whatever land was left over was sold to white settlers. Well, in the end, 2/3 of the land that used to be on reservations ended up being bought by whites, so Native Americans lost even more land because of this. And here's a photo of Helen Hunt Jackson, the woman who published the book A Century of Dishonor, trying to speak up for the rights of Native Americans. And here's a poster, a flyer that would have gone out to promote the Native American land that was now for sale after the Dawes Act. Notice how it's promoting the land to white Americans. And then here's an example of assimilation. Notice the picture on the left. This was a Native American, a teenager actually, who on the right-hand side, notice his hair was cut, his clothes have changed. He's not wearing jewelry anymore. This is an example of assimilation. Notice how on the right side too that the photographer lightened the picture so he doesn't appear as dark. That's just a special effect. His skin really wouldn't have lightened that much. Another reason why Native Americans struggled was because of the near extinction of the buffalo on the Great Plains. In 1800, 65 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains, but less than 100 years later, by 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained. They nearly went extinct due to overhunting. They were hunted by tourists, they were hunted by fur traders, and the U.S. Army supported hunting in order to hurt the Native Americans. They knew the Native Americans relied on buffalo in the Great Plains, and so they knew by killing buffalo and letting them go to waste that it would hurt the Native Americans. And these photos will give you an example of how they encouraged Americans to hunt. Here's some buffalo skins. Notice how many buffalo skins are loaded up, ready to be shipped for trade. And here are skulls, a guy standing in front of skulls of buffaloes who've been killed that were not accessed by Native Americans. Well, in this time period, there's a moment known as the Massacre or the Battle of Wounded Knee, but really it was a massacre that closed this particular chapter in Native American history, and it's a very dark moment. But it begins with something known as the ghost dance movement that was spread amongst the Sioux. Remember, the Sioux had been forced onto a reservation, and the ghost dance movement was this belief that by performing a specific ritual, it would lead to the disappearance of whites, and the buffalo would return, and the land would be returned to the Native Americans. And there was a fear that arose amongst white Americans about this ritual, and that the Native Americans were actually planning an uprising. And this led indirectly to the death of Sitting Bull, who was killed on the reservation, killed by other Sioux in 1890 because they thought he was part of this movement. So many of the Sioux were rounded up and taken to this camp at Wounded Knee Creek on the Sioux Reservation in what is today South Dakota. And in December of 1890, again, there was this fear that Native Americans were planning an uprising. And so the U.S. Cavalry, the 7th Cavalry, which actually was George Armstrong Custer's old regiment, you remember, from the Battle of Little Bighorn, they went around and they were picking up all the weapons that the Native Americans had. And while this was happening, one of the guns went off, and this led to 300 mostly unarmed Sioux being killed within minutes. The 7th Cavalry even had basically what are today machine guns and had far more weapons than the Native Americans. And so this was a bloody, bloody one-sided battle where very few Americans were killed, just a handful, but mostly 300 unarmed Sioux, mostly old men and women and children were killed. And this is considered the end of what are called the Indian Wars during this time period. That's not to say that Native Americans did not resist and did not challenge and simply just gave up, but during this time period, this closes one chapter. And we'll come back and you'll be researching to see what Native Americans have done to represent their people and to fight for their rights since this time period. Here's a drawing of what the ghost dance might have looked like. We don't have any photographs or any videos of this, so this is just imagination based on descriptions of what it might have looked like. And here's a photograph after the massacre at Wounded Knee. Again, this was in December of 1890 in South Dakota. It was extremely cold, and it actually took some time for the bodies to be buried because the ground was so hard, and a lot of the bodies were left and froze in position. So in this photo and in this photo, you can see how many bodies there were and how they were just left out there to freeze. So a very dark moment in the history of the United States.